Hey, y'all. Welcome back for another session here at the Gay Street Studios. Little more overcast this Friday afternoon. Don't know if it's going to rain or not. Real nice outside though. Hope you're doing well. Hope you had a good week. Hope you're ensconced in someplace comfy for the weekend. Um, Hope everybody's doing okay. Um, I was thinking about that moment in High Tone Old Christian woman that we looked at last time. And you remember that phrase, the jar was tall and of a port in air. I talked about portly a lot, but I just realized I just couldn't let it go. I was thinking about it, because I wanted a better way of talking about the tall end of a port in air. And of course, a couple of obvious things came to mind, as they always do, like a day late. Um, uh, Air, we use the word atmosphere. Well, atmosphere is literally air, but it's also, atmosphere also describes ambience, or if you want to Frenchy it up, ambiance, right? So ambiance is the aura that pervades a particular place. Um, and we'd say, why don't we go to another place? I don't like the atmosphere here. It's too many, too many homophobe frat boys here. I'm going to go somewhere else. That kind of, that use of atmosphere. And so Stephen's air is, partakes of that idea. And then the other thing I came up with that would have made it so much clearer is, our expression putting on airs. The tall end of a port in air is the jar, portly, stout, a little proud, a little absurd, putting on airs of dominion, airs of superiority. So tall end of a port in air. You have a better sense for what that phrase means. Now notice, we just spent a few minutes talking about Stephen's use of a particular phrase, and it's the reason for that is because I think I used the term deviant precision. There's a marvelous human specificity in that phrase, right? Um, a marvelous accuracy with respect to our humanity in that phrase. But it's a little bit, the phrasing is a little bit awry. It doesn't fit our expected patterns of our expected lexical patterns, right? And for that reason, of course, it's memorable. And for that reason, of course, it's beautiful. And for that reason, of course, McKelly stays up thinking about it, for 2 hours at night. What would have been a better phrase? I think I was thinking about it as I was doing, I try and do a daily walk, the 62-year-old white bald dude daily walk during COVID to try and stay at least, relatively slender and relatively in shape. And I was, that's when I was thinking, I find that walking, you probably don't think this now because I don't think young people do, but as you get older, you may find that walking is a wonderful time to get in touch with yourself and center yourself around issues that you may feel are important that you haven't had a chance to think about, or indeed, it's a time to step away from all the important issues that are constantly occupying your mind. That second one rarely happens with me, as you might imagine, um, having been taught for me for this many class periods. Even remotely, that the manic passion comes through, that sort of intellectual restlessness, Um, but we have to embrace who we are, I suppose. Okay, well, we're going to talk about Sunday morning. We'll talk about the first two stanzas. Pardon me, as usual, allergies. First two stanzas of this great poem. Great poem. One of the most important poems in the American language. Um, yeah, just in terms of outline, you have a structure here that is quite evident. Just if you look at it broadly, you have 8 stanzas, right? So there's a certain symmetry implied in that number 8. 4 times 2, 2 times 2 times 2. Certain symmetry implied there. And then you also have 15 lines per stanza. So for each one of those 8 stanzas, 15 lines, making a total of 120 lines. And again, I don't want to make too much of this, 120 lines, but that, that number 120, it's kind of a significant number. It's think of a circle as having 360 degrees, 120 is a third of that. 120, it's half of 240. 12, half of 24. It's one of those numbers that is structurally significant for reasons we can't really put our finger on it. And I don't want to, but there's a kind of, how if I put it this way, there's a kind of, just from those numbers, 8 stanzas of 15 lines, making a total of 120 lines. I get a feeling structurally, I get a feeling of a structure that embodies a kind of completion, a kind of consummation, a kind of wholeness, a kind of integrity, a oneness, a wholeness, a fullness, a richness, a rightness. Am I insane? But that's what I think. I think these numbers, I think the way you guys who are poets think about this, you guys who are songwriters think about this, or if you love poetry, if you love music, the structures that we choose convey with them meanings that you can't put your finger on logically. You can't put your finger on rationally. You can't put your finger on rhetorically. Yeah, but they structures establish certain linkages with us as human beings. You can see it in the sonnet, at work in the sonnet. You can think about rationales, why the sonnet has taken hold as powerfully as it has. But there's something about, think of the Shakespearean, something about those, those 3 sections of 4 rhymed quatrains, if they rhyme, classically, followed by that blast of 2 rhymed, 2 rhymed lines at the end, that couplet, a total of 14 lines. Well, it does something for us. It does something to us. I think also of the musical structure of the blues. There's something about that organization, that structural organization, that what is it, 1, 3, 4 organizational pattern. A, B, A, repeated structurally in the great blues songs. There's something about that pattern that rings a bell in us, that chimes somewhere in our humanity, that's kind of just right. And I'm not sure exactly what it is, but it's there. It's profoundly there. Which is why so many, I'm tempted to say all, but so many pop songs today are at their core, if you strip them all the way down to their modal form, you see the blues, right? And that's in pop music. And jazz, it's even, I think it's even more potent. Okay, and then the other point I wanted to make organizationally here, so you have 8 stanzas. Well, you start, the title of the poem, you start with Sunday morning. And Sunday morning, the poem takes you from Sunday, 8 stanzas to a new Sunday by the end of the poem. So 7 days a week plus 1. Sunday through Saturday, 7 plus 1, 8 Sunday, from old Sunday to new Sunday. And symbolically speaking, that's exactly what the poem does. It takes us from an old notion of spiritual richness and an older notion of meaning, and introduces us to new possibilities, a new possibility. And in that sense, it is a scriptural poem. It's a kind of gospel. It's a kind of good news, but a gospel that overturns conventional gospels. Yeah. And this poem does it, very, very directly, right? It's a very controversial poem in that way. Once you really see what Stevens is proposing, which we will. Okay. So what I want to do is take you through, what I'll do is take you through first two stanzas today. They're substantial. And I'll give you a little outline of each one, kind of an interpretive outline, and then we'll look at the actual text, which of course is the great pleasure of studying poetry, the ability to telescope in and see the particulars and then telescope back out. It's Blake's old, I think I've mentioned it before, it's Blake's old apothegm, heaven in a wildflower and the world in a grain of sand. Or is it the universe in a grain of sand? I always forget. Heaven in a wildflower. Right? In other words, in the particular, this is what all great poets do, right? In the particular, we discover the universal. In the granular, we discover the abstract. In the local, we discover the universal. Very powerful, right? And that's one of the great pleasures about being a student of poetry, as we are, about teaching it and about attempting to learn something about it. Okay, so stanza one. Stanza one presents a young woman taking a late, luxurious breakfast on the day of our Lord, a Sunday. A time when, conventionally speaking, she ought to be at church. Her morning is, and Stevens establishes this very carefully, her morning is full of vivid color, fragrance, taste, sound, and emotion. You could think of this, the early part of this first stanza as presenting a kind of synesthesia of contentment, a synesthesia of lazy happiness. We'll talk. There's a certain lassitude, a certain sensual lassitude at play. That's pretty good. In these early lines, I always come up with these damn lines that I should have written down ahead of time. It's weird the way the mind works, isn't it? You guys who are interested in teaching will find that that's a very rewarding, yet it's also a very frustrating experience, because you'll study something and you'll prep something and you'll have it in language, you'll have it in language and you'll have it up here, but then something happens when you're actually talking about it to people who care about it. Something magical happens, and your mind shifts into a different drive. Very, very powerful. So these vibrant experiential details, at first, Stevens's word is dissipate, line 9. They dissipate the somber, sober silence of the day, that Sunday, which, rightly, symbolically, Stevens associates with the crucifixion of the man, Jesus. Then, so you have the dissipation, but then what Stevens calls, quote unquote, line 7, that old catastrophe, that old crucifixion, that old act of cruelty, that old predatory murder, that old catastrophe, Stevens's word, encroaches, line 7, encroaches upon the blood, then that old catastrophe encroaches upon and mortifies these vivid sensations. The presence of, quote unquote, the blood and sepulcher, in the last line of the stanza. The presence of the blood and sepulcher is the blood of the crucifixion and the sepulcher of the grave where the body of the man Jesus was placed. The presence of the blood and sepulcher robs the morning of its peaceful, rich, sensual bounty. Right? So there's kind of a précis of that first stanza, an interpretive précis, a way of seeing the language, right? A way of getting at Stevens' early meanings, the way Stevens frames his early meanings in the poem. So let's look at the language. One, and he starts with this beautiful, this impossible synecdoche, this beautiful line, striking, striking. It's another one of those lines like tall and of a port in air. It's a line that's that rings in its deviance, in its strangeness, but there's a wonder in that deviance as well. There's a kind of magic in the language. Stevens finds a way of phrasing that eliminates the banal and introduces freshness and a wonder into the poem, into the idea. Complacencies of the peignoir and late coffee and oranges in a sunny chair. Okay, complacencies of the peignoir. So you know what a peignoir is. A peignoir is essentially, you young ladies know what it is. It's essentially, it's a sexy nightgown, basically. So we have a portrait, so the peignoir here, a peignoir, I say it's an impossible synecdoche. A peignoir, obviously, the synecdoche for the woman, right? So we picture a woman, but the peignoir is used as the noun representing her as opposed to, representing her directly. But peignoirs can't be complacent, right? So Stevens takes this vivid synecdoche peignoir, but then humanizes the inanimate synecdoche that he's chosen to stand in symbolically for the human. You see? So the peignoir stands in symbolically for the human, but then Stevens imbues that inanimate synecdoche with the human quality of complacency. And then, as if that weren't enough, he pluralizes it, complacencies, as if the complacencies are multiple, too many to mention, and so it's a very striking line and a very rich line, and Beckham's interpretation. Complacencies. There's the idea of complacency. It's from the Latin word placeo, Placeo, placeo. I please. So complacency is a kind of pleasing, a self-pleasedness, if you will. It's a pleasing together, a complacency. And complacency involves a suspension of ambition, right? A suspension of anxiety, a suspension of guilt, like a suspension of the kind of guilt that motivates achievement. You let it go. Those beautiful mornings when you let it go. You let go what you need to accomplish. You need what you want to accomplish, and you just revel in the body, and you revel in the peace. You revel in the being. Not the becoming. You revel in the being, not the becoming, And the body is part of that being, isn't it? And the spirit is part of that being. Untethered from greed, untethered from guilt, untethered from ambition, untethered from anxiety. Complacencies of the peignoir. And late coffee and oranges in a sunny chair, and the green freedom of a cockatoo upon a rug. I'm going to continue, but look at those details, and what has to strike you immediately about those particular details. Look at how sensual they are, right? Look at the sensory detail in these words, in this language. They're highly visual, they're highly olfactory, they're highly auditory, and they're highly sensory, right? So you smell the oranges, you feel the cold of the oranges, you taste the oranges, And what's more redolent than coffee? The smell of it, the beans grinding, the smell of the coffee brewing, and that taste of the warm coffee and the wet. God, I'm going to do this tomorrow morning. I swear, I'm going to go out to the store today and buy a cockatoo and get a green rug, or get a rug and watch that Green Freedom tomorrow morning. It'll be Saturday. I'll write my poem. Will be Saturday morning. I know you're waiting with bated breath for that. So the taste and scent of the coffee and the oranges and the color as well, right? The dark, rich coffee. They put a little cream in it, so it gets that beautiful brown color. In the sunny chair, so you're sitting in the sun with the coffee, and you're looking down, and there's on the rug is your pet cockatoo. Green, and of course there's motion, there's feathers, there's the sound of wings, and maybe there's the cawing, right? So motion, sound, scent, taste, all of it. Just wanted to point out also the wonderful language, Stevens, the green freedom. Now you see what he's doing there. It's not unlike what he's doing with complacencies of the peignoir. Now you guys who are going to be teachers, but you guys, especially you guys who are writers, maybe you're going to be a writer and a teacher, but look at what he does with green freedom. Okay, freedom is an abstraction, right? It's not a material item. It's not a material entity, right? Freedom is an abstraction. It can't be green. Right? Abstractions have no color, right? But what Stephen's doing is through allying that adjective green to the abstraction freedom, by that alliance, that impossible, it works grammatically, but semantically it doesn't work, because freedom can't be green, yet it's poetry, right? So it defeats those regulatory strictures of language, but defeats those regulatory strictures elegantly. You see? So then you read the whole line, and the green freedom of a cockatoo, and it's the freedoms associated with the cockatoo via the adjective green, which actually belongs to the cockatoo and not to the freedom. You see? But now the three of those, the two nouns, cockatoo and freedom, and the adjective green, now form a trio, a kind of a semantic trio. They belong to one another as a kind of single vivid unit. Right? And that single, that's not unlike Pound's notion of the image, is it? Right? It's three distinct elements that function magically together to create a third vivid meaning into which and out of which ideas are rushing. You see that? That, my friends, is poetry. And nobody does it better than Stevens. Okay. They mingle, and the effect of their mingling, I'm just picking up the language here, the effect of their mingling, they mingle upon a rug, they mingle, what's their effect? To dissipate the holy hush of ancient sacrifice. And of course, I love, do you have a footnote on, thanks for the answer there, Mr. Editor, Madam Editor. We really appreciate that. Anytime you can obtrude into my reading of the poem with a footnote, I always appreciate it. Seriously, just these footnotes just kill you, particularly in this poem. It's like the editor is saying, "Yeah, it's easy. I'm on it. Here's what I think. It's what you should think too." The holy hush of ancient sacrifice, and it is that death that we associate with the man Jesus on Sunday mornings, when we should all be at church. They dissipate the holy hush of that ancient sacrifice. In other words, they dissipate, they limit, they disperse that silence. They disperse that quiet with their vividness, with their color, with their taste, with their life, right? She dreams a little and she feels the dark encroachment of that old catastrophe. Okay, so that old catastrophe, the sacrifice of the man Jesus, upon which the Christian tradition is founded, right? That sacrifice encroaches upon um, the dream, encroaches upon the vivid, sensuous life she feels around her on this peaceful morning. That old catastrophe encroaches as a calm darkens among water lights. The pungent oranges and bright green wings, in other words, that we've just seen in the early part of the stanza, the pungent oranges and bright green wings the idea is now, after this encroachment of that old catastrophe upon them, you see, that old catastrophe, that crucifixion, that sacrifice, um, after the encroachment of those symbolic events upon this piece, the pungent oranges and bright green wings seem things in some procession of the dead, winding across wide water without sound. So what had been so vivid and so full of life, so full of the sensuous bounty of our humanity, is now drained of life and falls into this parade of the dead across wide water, um, this parade of loss, this parade of suffering, this parade of sacrifice. The day is like wide water without sound. So not only does this old catastrophe subsume the vivid life of the details that we encounter early in the poem, but the day itself now falls in behind them in this somber parade, this somber parade of the contemplation of sacrifice and death. Um, the day is like wide water without sound, stilled for the passing of her dreaming feet over the seas to silent Palestine. So the memory, the dominance, the symbolic domination of that old catastrophe over Sunday has drawn into it the vivid details of life bursting around her, and the day itself into which she awakened in the morning, and then herself now following it all in that somber parade, all the way. I'm thinking in her imagination, in her soul, in her spirit, all the way to silent Palestine. That is the land in which redemption is wed to pain, suffering of the Savior, and death, from which the Savior is said to have arisen. Dominion of the blood and sepulchre. So Palestine, the the land where, the land that is ruled, so to speak, the land symbolically ruled by suffering and sacrifice, the two essential components of redemption, a redemption that takes us past death in the Christian tradition. Okay? Let me see where we are time-wise. Okay. Okay, second stanza. I'm going to take you through notes again. So, break the second stanza into two different halves, okay? You can even draw a little line to indicate this. The first half of the stanza, which is the first 7 lines, so lines 16 to 22, the first half of the stanza asks 3 consecutive questions. They're literal questions. These questions challenge the central, definitive Christian association of redemption with suffering, sacrifice, and death. Let me repeat that. The first half of the stanza asks 3 consecutive questions. These questions challenge the central, definitive Christian association of redemption with suffering, sacrifice, and death. And these questions challenge the idea that richness, fulfillment, and ultimate meaning, Stevens uses the word divinity, line 17, heaven, paradise, right? These questions challenge the idea that richness, fulfillment, and ultimate meaning, divinity, heaven, paradise, must reside only beyond the realm of human experience, in a celestial realm, beyond death, where faith is rewarded and quote unquote sin is punished. That is, in a heaven beyond us. So the questions challenge those conventional notions, and indeed the bedrock notions of the Christian imagination, right? Let's work through these first lines, 16 to 22. So stanza 2. Why should she give her bounty to the dead? Right? So there's a crystallization of what we've just seen occurring in the first stanza. And so notice again, just like with High Tonal Christian Woman and with Anecdote of the Jar, the syllogistic quality. There's a logic, a stanzaic logic at work. Just like with the stanzas in a sonnet, speaking of sonnets and Shakespearean sonnets, just like the divisions between the stanzas in the sonnet and the final couplet. Right? There's a structural logic that governs the placement of those elements in the sonnet. Same with this poem. Okay, and a line like this, the first line of the second stanza, establishes that logic, that developmental organization in no uncertain terms. Right? Why should she give her bounty to the dead? That's what has happened in the first. See, now you can go back at that first stanza and kind of align the details in it such that this line is what they lead to, right? This line confirms the reading we've just gone through of the first stanza. Why should she give her bounty to the dead the way she just has in this as related in this first stanza? Second question, what is divinity? Notice how, incidentally, notice how tendentious this is. You know, this is you can feel a proposition being leveled here. This is an argument, right? Just like with High Tone Christian Woman, right? It's a kind of a call and response, almost a Platonic or a Socratic dialogue, a question and answering, right? And you'll feel that very strongly as we continue this organizational structure. But there's something at stake here, right? Stevens is making a point, and the point is coming through by the tendentious nature of these questions. By tendentious, I mean, you're tendentious when you have something to prove and you're sticking to it, right? It's a way of saying it's an argumentative, right? Not in the sense argumentative in the sense of wanting to start a fight, not at all, but argumentative in the sense of wanting to satisfy an inquiry that's important to you for some reason, and wanting to explore an idea that you've had with respect to a particular set of realities, whatever they may be, right? A particular reality, whatever it may be. Why should she give her bounty to the dead, like we've just seen happen? What is divinity if it can come only in silent shadows and in dreams, which is what we've just seen in the first stanza? That is, when it can come only in silent shadows and in dreams, as opposed to in vivid, living human experience, which is where we started out the first stanza, right? But that old catastrophe coerced symbolically the initial meanings of the beautiful vividness of the life around this woman. It subsumed the life and meaning that she had begun by experiencing in this Sunday morning. What is divinity if it can come only in silent shadows and in dreams? Shall she not find in comforts of the sun, there's the sunny chair, in pungent fruit, there's the orange, and bright green wings, the cockatoo, or else in any balm or beauty of the earth, that is not of the celestial, not on that which is above and beyond, not in abstraction, not in idea, but of the earth. Why shall she not find in comforts of the sun, in pungent fruit, in bright green wings, or else in any balm, not just those balms, right? Balm is that which can heal us. That a balm is a salve for our soul that can heal us in our woundedness, in our experiential anger, in our ontological anxiety, and so on. That can find us in our lostness. That's what a balm is. Shall she not find in comforts of the sun, in pungent fruit, in bright green wings, or in any balm or beauty of the earth, shall she not find things to be cherished, like the thought of heaven? It's an idea of eternal fulfillment. Can't that exist in the vivid details of our experience here and now? Is there not a plenitude in it? Is there not a richness in it? Is it not eternal in its way? Is it not consummate and consummating in a way that an abstract idea on the other side of death is not? I'm attempting to dramatize the meanings of the poem. Okay. So that brings us to the second half of the stanza. The second half of the stanza continues this challenge. That is the challenge leveled by these questions, right? And the questions, they become rhetorical questions. They become questions that are really more like propositions, right? That contribute to the syllogistic flux of the poem itself, right? That contribute to the developmental and propositional logic of the poem as it unfolds before us, stanza by stanza by stanza. You see? The second half of the stanza continues this challenge, proposing becomes overtly propositional, and you'll see that in a minute. Proposing that richness, fulfillment, and meaning, that is, divinity, heaven, I'm quoting, quote divinity, quote heaven from this section of the stanza, that riches, fulfillment, and meaning must be intimately and concretely and experientially and perceivably available to us, indeed in us as human beings, and in fact manifest themselves in the diverse weathers of our world, in our internal subjective weathers, our emotions, in our external objective weathers, the climatological weathers of our world externally, um, the climatological weathers of our world, yes, but also the sociological weathers of our world, the political weathers of our world, which similarly, like the climatological weathers, um, give form and shape and meaning to the world through which we walk as human beings, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. But that is the world. Those are the elements that constitute the world that we walk through. So the diverse weathers of our world, in our internal subjective weathers, our emotions, in our external objective weathers, climatological, sociological, political, etc. In seasons of ripeness and plenty, in seasons of loss and death, in the reciprocal relation of these different weathers, of these different seasons to one another. Let me just give you that language again. Um, the second half of the stanza continues this challenge, proposing that richness, fulfillment, and meaning, divinity, heaven, paradise, must be intimately and concretely and experientially and perceivably available to us, indeed in us as humans, and in fact manifest themselves in the diverse weathers of our world, in our internal subjective weathers, our emotions, in our external objective weathers, sociological, political, environmental, climatological, all impacting us, and in the reciprocal relation of these different weathers, these different seasons to one another. Seasons of ripeness and plenty, seasons of loss and death. I'm going to work through the poem, but I'm reminded I was reminded of a really important figure here that nobody studies anymore. A figure named Meister Eckhart, Eckhart, Meister, means master, or the idea you could think of it as father. He was a religious figure. Father Eckhart, Meister, Master Eckhart, Eckhart. He was a German, and he was a mystic. He was a Christian. He was a Dominican. He's a Dominican priest / monk, right? Medieval, lived in the late 13th and early 14th centuries. If you're interested in alternative spiritualities, or if you're interested in the expansion of the Christian tradition, or reaching back into the past of the Christian tradition, a past which had a more mystical edge and was less institutional, less ideological, and more experiential, and more full of more poetry, you might be interested in looking at Meister Eckhart. And he's full of, his language, his realizations. It's like reading the Buddha. It's very, very similar to me. It's like reading the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. It's like reading the Upanishads. I'm very interested in these spiritual investigations that are also literary investigations. which is what the Quran is as well, spoken and written. By definition, the Quran, it's expressive, right? It was dictation. It was dictation. Amazing. Uh, and we impute that to the Gospels, and we impute that to the Old Testament as well. So dictation from on high. That's what the poets are doing too. That's what Stevens is doing too. Only his dictations come from a source that hasn't been tapped yet, or hasn't been tapped sufficiently, because it overturns too much of the status quo. Always reminds me of Meister Eckhart. Let me just give you a couple of quotes from Meister Eckhart. It's one of those writers that feel like your head is being opened up by a can opener and filled up with things you've never seen before, and then closed back up, like a Mary Shelley creation. Here's Meister Eckhart, 14th century mystic, Christian monk, Dominican, German. The eye with which God, leave it to me to screw it up. The eye with which I see God is the very same eye with which God sees me. Think about the implications of that. The eye with which I see God, so the eye with which I see God is the very same eye with which God sees me. Do you see? This is why he was considered an apostate, a heretic. Not seriously, he wasn't burned at the stake, but you could see how contrary, how revolutionary such an idea would be. He's imputing a kind of equivalence between the human and the earthly, and the eternal and the divine. The eternal and the divine, and the human and the earthly partake of one another, are one another. I'll give you another one. The ultimate leave taking is the leaving of God for God. The ultimate leave taking is the leaving of God for God. It's a counter-conventional proposition, isn't it? It's a proposition that says you have to leave behind the conventional and arrive at a new understanding that has freed itself from the ideologies of the conventional that coerce and that co-opt. It seems to me that this poem participates in that ultimate leave-taking. It's an instance of that ultimate leave-taking, the leaving of God for God. Think of how many of us are content with that the first stage, and never move toward the second stage. You know, that's the danger of reading poetry. it's the danger of loving music, because you start to get intimations that there's more. So let's look at this great second half. And here's the proposition it begins with. Let's see how we're doing on time here. Okay. Here's the proposition. Divinity must live within herself. The eye with which I see God is exactly the same eye with which God sees me. Divinity must live within herself. Passions of rain, or moods in falling snow, grieving are the weathers that I was alluding to. Passions of rain. Notice that Stevens brilliant at this. Notice the interior emotional life of human subjectivity and the exterior climatological, environmental, atmospheric, speaking of air, right? Atmospheric life, right? Social life, political life, the world out there, they partake of one another, they are one another, right? passions of rain, moods of falling snow. You see the equivalence, the reciprocity between the interior and the exterior, between the subjective and the objective, between the self and the world through which the self walks. Grievings in loneliness, or unsubdued elations when the forest blooms. There it is again. Gusty emotions, wind, gusty emotions, subjective, on wet roads, on autumn nights. All pleasures, all pains, remembering the bough of summer, that is the time of plenitude, the time of richness, the time of ripeness, the bough of summer and the winter branch, the times of loss, the times of want, the times of grief. These are the measures destined for her soul. It's a great line, isn't it? These are the measures. That is, you know, when he says these, what Stevens means here is those external weathers, climatological weathers, in other words, physical weathers, sociological weathers, so to speak, political, social, etc., and then the emotional weathers, taken together, almost like those three words that we talked about earlier: green, cockatoo, freedom. Those three elements taken together are what create us here, and what are the divine in us now, right? And Stevens will go on to explore this in greater detail, but he's beginning to establish it here in stanza number 2. These are the measures destined for her soul. It's wonderful, isn't it? Measures, that word measures, it's perfect. Like so many of Stevens's words, look at the multiple meanings. Measure is a word taken from music, right? So these are the symphonies of her soul that he's just described in those weathers, interior, external, the measures, the symphonies, the melodies, the harmonies, right, of her soul. Measures as in, you know, how many beats to a measure, right? But there's also measure from the world of science and mathematics, right? Those kinds of measures, right? This is there's the idea of the measure as a portion, you know, there's a little, all of us have to live with a certain measure of grief and a certain measure of loss to counterbalance the measure of joy and the measure of contentment, etc., right? So there's that form of measure as well. These are the measures destined for her soul. Okay, very good, and we'll continue with Wally next time, and I want to here. Talk a little bit about our next jazz artist, is Chick Webb. Let me just read a reading from our great book Jazz by Jeff Ward. Okay, there's a club in Harlem in the 20s and 30s called the Savoy, 40s as well, I think, the Savoy. And it was a place, one of the few clubs in Harlem, one of the few clubs anywhere, I should say, where Black people and white people danced. They danced together, and they danced. I mean, they danced. There were Black people and white people in attendance, and they also danced together. American apartheid slowly being eroded by the joy of jazz, right? And we're talking in the 30s here. So there's a guy who's a dancer, who's a famous dancer. His name is Frankie Manning. And he talks about entering the Savoy, right? As we're climbing up the steps, I could hear this music coming down. And we started saying, oh man, you hear that music? Wow. And we walked through the door and we turned around. As you come up the steps, when you come through the doors, your back is to the bandstand. So you turn around and then you face the band. And as I turn around, the floor was full of people. And it looked like everyone on the floor was doing the Lindy Hop. Everybody was just bouncing up and down, and the music was romping and stomping. And we started looking at each other. Hey, man, you hear this music? Look at all these people in this place dancing and jumping. And the floor was, looked like the floor was getting into the mood of the dance, because the floor was just bouncing up and down, and the people were bouncing up and down, and Chick Webb was on the bandstand wailing. Boy, it was just such a wonderful time in our life to come up there as youngsters and be exposed to this kind of music. Oh, wow. Chick Webb, the man who most often made that kind of music at the Savoy. He was the king of the Savoy, right? He was the African American king of swing in the 20s, moving into the 30s. The man who often made that kind of music at the Savoy was born with a hunchback, stood less than 4 feet tall, and lived all his life in constant pain. He was, as Downbeat crudely put it, Downbeat the jazz magazine crudely put it, deformed, dwarfish, and delicate, end quote. But his friend and sometime publicist Helen Oakley remembered self-pity was completely foreign to him. And while he never learned to read music, he made himself into the most innovative drummer of his time. He could be explosive. When he really let go, said Gene Krupa, I remember Gene Krupa was in Benny Goodman's band. When he really let go, you had a feeling that the entire atmosphere was being changed, unquote. But he also brought to the drums a new melodic conception. His breaks and solos were musical as well as exciting. Webb's body was so diminutive that when he stood up to play, as he sometimes did, fully half his height was hidden behind his big bass drum. But he had long arms. His hands and feet were outsized. His wrists and ankles were like iron, and he was a master showman. Doc Cheatham. Before Chick, drummers were essentially timekeepers. Webb was shy and amiable and off stage, but once the little giant was seated behind his drums on the larger of the Savoy's 2 bandstands, it took a brave band leader to dare lay claim to the other one. He would just lay there for other bands to come up here, the trombonist Dickie Wells remembered. Ain't nobody, Webb told his men over and over again, gonna cut me or my band. Ain't nobody gonna cut me or my band. Okay. This is Chick Webb and his orchestra with Ella Fitzgerald.
A tisket, a tasket, a brown and yellow basket. I send a letter to my mommy. On the way I dropped it, I dropped it, I dropped it. Yes, on the way I dropped it. A little girlie picked it up and put it in her pocket. She was trucking on down the avenue, but not a single thing to do. She went peck, peck, pecking all around. When she spied it on the ground, she took it, my little yellow basket. And if she doesn't bring it back, I think that I will die. A tisket, a tasket, I lost my yellow basket. And if that girlie don't return it, don't know what I'll do. Oh dear, I I wonder where my basket can be.
Solo-wee, 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 solo-wee.
Oh, gee, I wish that little girl I could see.
Solo-wee, 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 solo-wee.
Oh, why was I so careless with that basket of mine? That itty-bitty basket was the joy of mine. A tisket, a tasket, I lost my yellow basket. Won't someone help me find my basket and make me happy again, again?
Was it green?
No, 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 no.
Was it red?
No, 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 no.
Was it blue?
No, 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 no. Just a little yellow basket.